Today, I will speak about the experiences of women during the Civil War. The focus will be on the many ways women contributed to the war effort as told through the stories of a variety of individuals. Some of the women who will be featured were prominent figures at the time, and others have had their stories told in the 150 years plus since the war ended. These are just a few of the millions of women across the country who contributed to the war. Nearly half of the 31.4 million people in the United States in 1860 were women. And I think it's important to begin with just a brief introduction to what life was like for women in the United States as the war loomed. The experiences of women in the 19th century were profoundly shaped by the cult of true womanhood, which was an ideology developed during the early 19th century that emphasized the importance of piety, submissiveness, and domesticity in women. The Civil War brought a number of challenges to this idea and presented women with new responsibilities and opportunities that were typically considered outside of the accepted norms of the time. A majority of free women, particularly in the South, worked at home. They helped their husbands in fields and maintained the house while their spouses were occupied. In the industrialized North, there were few employment options for women outside the home. Many women were teachers and others did domestic work in homes or worked in factories. These jobs could be difficult and unsafe at times, and women were typically paid something like a half to two-thirds of men's wages. Women who worked also had to contend with the social pressure that came along with it, because women who were employed outside of their home were often looked down upon in society. And they could become the object of pity or scorn. For these women, for these reasons, it was mostly younger, unmarried women who were employed, and they were expected to leave the workforce once they were married. The war obviously brought with it many societal changes and affected really every family in the United States, with experiences varying depending on individual circumstances. So people in cities were impacted by the war in a different way than people in rural areas. People of means had a very different experience than underprivileged people, and white and Black people saw the war from starkly different perspectives. Despite the limitations placed on them by society, women were extremely active during the war. They served as nurses, soldiers, spies, relief aides. They took over running family farms. They cared for children and aging parents, and they found work outside the home. Thousands of women volunteered as nurses during the war. There are estimates that put that figure somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 women. While women would have been versed in home care, nursing was officially a male-dominated profession before the war. Other than nuns who were expected to be self-sacrificial, women who wanted to work as nurses were deemed morally questionable in 19th century America. The war brought a shift to these expectations out of necessity, but it was difficult to convince men, particularly doctors, to change their way of thinking. Women who volunteered to serve as nurses had to deal with resistance from medical staff, patients, as well as military officers. African-American nurses were relegated often to menial labor jobs or ordered to work with dangerously ill patients or assigned only to African-American patients. One woman who worked to challenge these expectations and ideas was Elizabeth Blackwell. She was the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States. Elizabeth and her sister worked as teachers before Elizabeth began to study medicine in the late 1840s. Despite being rejected by the leading medical schools, she was eventually admitted to Geneva Medical College in New York and graduated first in her class in 1849. Her time at the school was extremely difficult for her. She had to endure harassment and was shunned by her male colleagues and the residents of Geneva. To receive further training and eventual employment, Elizabeth went to Europe for a few years before returning to the United States. And the decade before the Civil War, Elizabeth and her sister Emily, who was also a doctor by this time, and another female doctor, established the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. When the war began, she helped organize the Women's Central Association of Relief and worked to select and train nurses for the war. Estimates show that about 300 women had received a medical degree in the United States by 1860. While the side effects of an eye infection while studying in Paris prevented Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell from becoming a surgeon, Mary Edwards Walker went on to become the first female surgeon in the United States. Mary, who was a women's rights activist, abolitionist, and spy, was the daughter of abolitionist parents who encouraged her to challenge the norms. One of the ways she challenged these expectations for women was by wearing non-traditional bloomer dress instead of skirts and corsets. The bloomer dress included pantaloons or pants that would be worn over or underneath a skirt. She was encouraged to become educated, which was something that was not expected of women, not common for women at the time. Mary first became a teacher and eventually earned enough money to go to Syracuse Medical College, where she received a medical degree in 1855. She married that same year, and she and her husband started a medical practice in Rome, New York, but they were unsuccessful because people rejected the idea of a female doctor. At the outset of the war, she attempted to aid the military as a doctor, but was not allowed to serve because of her gender. She instead served as an unpaid volunteer surgeon in the U.S. Patent Office Hospital in Washington, and eventually as a doctor near the front lines of Virginia. She was finally accepted as a surgeon by the Army in 1863, becoming the first woman to serve in that position. She was captured as a spy the following year and was held prisoner for 4 months. During her imprisonment, Mary refused to wear traditional women's clothing, which she found uncomfortable. Following her release, Mary became the assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor by President Andrew Johnson after the war. Another woman who had to contend with resistance from military medical personnel was Dorothea Dix. When the war began, she completely dedicated herself to the cause and was appointed as the first superintendent of U.S. Army nurses in June 1861, becoming the first woman to serve in such a role for the federal government. She oversaw a large staff of nurses who she insisted needed to be, and many of you have heard this before, that the nurses needed to be between 35 and 50 years of age, in good health, of, quote, high moral standards, not too attractive, and willing to dress plainly. Dorothea fought for adequate resources for her nurses. She butted heads with military officials and doctors and ignored orders, earning her the nickname Dragon Dix. She also set a number of strict and sometimes autocratic rules for her nurses, but under her guidance, nursing care in the Army greatly improved. Dorothea is credited with appointing over 3,000 nurses and setting up numerous field hospitals and first aid stations during the war. Beloved novelist Louisa May Alcott also served as a nurse during the war. Louisa, as you may know, was the daughter of an educator father and a social worker mother, both of whom were abolitionists who aided the Underground Railroad. She was educated by prominent writers and educators, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Julia Ward Howe. Louisa was selected as a nurse by Dorothea Dix in 1862 and served in the Union Hospital in Georgetown that you see depicted in the illustration on the screen. Like most people, Louisa was unprepared for the death and the disease that she was exposed to, and she was forced to quickly become accustomed to seeing badly injured men. Of having to inform a soldier that he would not survive, she wrote, quote, "I could have sat down on the spot and cried heartily if I had not learned the wisdom of bottling up one's tears for leisure moment." She sat with him and held his hand in his death, a moment she described in the following way, quote, "I could not but be glad that through its touch, the presence of human sympathy perhaps had lighted that hard hour." Louisa was also very sensitive to the racism she witnessed by nurses who would not thank African Americans who worked in the hospital. And she was unabashedly partisan and really bristled at the idea of caring for Confederate soldiers. After only 6 weeks of service, she contracted pneumonia and typhus and returned home, where it was discovered that she also had mercury poisoning from administering calomel medicine. The stories she wrote based on her experiences were serialized in the anti-slavery newspaper, The Commonwealth, between May and June 1863, and they were published together as hospital sketches in August of that year. You may also be familiar with Mary Ann Bickerdike. Mary Ann served as a nurse in Galesburg, Illinois at the start of the Civil War. When the community purchased medical supplies to aid the war effort, they counted on Mary Ann to deliver them to Cairo, Illinois, where she established a hospital. Throughout the war, Mary Ann established more than 300 field hospitals and aided in the care of sick and wounded soldiers. Beginning with the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862, she was present at various Western battlefields, including the Battle of Shiloh, the Vicksburg Campaign, the Battle of Chattanooga, and the Campaign for Atlanta. There are stories about Mary Ann risking her life to search for soldiers, including walking through battlefields at night with a lantern. Her bravery won her the admiration of Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, as well as enlisted men who gave her the nickname Mother Bickerdike. In addition to her efforts on the battlefield, she also worked tirelessly to solicit gifts from civilians. In the post-war period, she fought for veterans and nurses who sought pensions from the government. While you're likely familiar with the Union's angel of the battlefield, Clara Barton, the South had its own angel in the form of humanitarian, nurse, and philanthropist Sally Louisa Tompkins, who was known as the Angel of the Confederacy. Coming from a wealthy family in Richmond, Virginia, Sally opened a private hospital to care for wounded Confederate soldiers. Named Robertson Hospital for Judge John Roberts, who donated his home for the cause, the hospital was operated at Sally's own expense with the aid of local women and enslaved laborers. After Jefferson Davis ordered private hospitals to close in September 1861, Robertson Hospital was allowed to remain open, and Sally was commissioned as an unassigned captain in the Confederate cavalry, becoming the only woman to hold a commission in the Confederate Army. This role allowed Sally to operate the hospital with the aid of the military. The hospital treated more than 1,300 patients, losing only 73 before closing in June 1865. Sally continued a charitable work in the post-war period and was often recognized for her efforts during the war. Her charitable work resulted in the depletion of her fortune, and she was eventually moved to the Confederate Women's Home in Richmond, where she died in 1916. She was buried with military honors. Phoebe Yates Levy Pember was a member of a prosperous Jewish family in Charleston, South Carolina. The family's wealth aided them in gaining a prominent position in Charleston. Her husband died of tuberculosis in July of 1861, and Phoebe and her family moved to Marietta, Georgia to escape the war. In late June 1862, Phoebe took a position as matron of Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, which was the largest military hospital in the country at the time. Phoebe supervised 150 wards, and an estimated 15,000 soldiers were under her care throughout the war. She was responsible for ensuring that surgeons' orders were followed, as well as that medical and dietary needs of patients were fulfilled. She also aided soldiers by writing home to their friends and families and comforted them while they were ill and dying. Phoebe described her experiences in the hospital and in Richmond in general in her memoirs, where she wrote, quote, "Walking home after the duties of the hospital were over, often when evening had well set in, during this time, the pavement around the railroad depot would be lined with wounded men, laid there to wait for ambulances to take them to the receiving hospital, some on stretchers, others on the bare bricks or in a thin blanket, suffering from wounds hastily wrapped around the coarse, galling, unbleached homespun bandages in which the blood had stiffened till every crease cut like a knife." Phoebe remained at the hospital until it was taken over by federal authorities following the fall of Richmond. Female nurses in the North and South, like Phoebe Pember, Sally Louisa Tompkins, Mary Ann Bickerdike, Louisa May Alcott, Dorothea Dix, and countless others, bravely challenged 19th century norms. And many of these women considered their time as nurses during the war as the definitive moment in their lives, leading many to further social and political service. Their work proved women were capable of being nurses and working in high-stress situations. By the end of the war, between 5,000 and 10,000 women had volunteered as nurses in both the North and the South, and that really did change the course of nursing in the United States. And women did much more than that, of course. So while Phoebe Pember was a nurse, her sister Eugenia was a Confederate spy. Eugenia Levy Phillips was just one of hundreds of women believed to have served as spies during the Civil War. Women who worked as spies gathered information about the size of armies, their plans, locations, often transmitting this information in scraps of paper sewn into clothing, wrapped into their hair, or hidden in their accessories. They also smuggled goods such as medicine and ammunition hidden in blankets, packages, and inside of dolls. When you think about the way society viewed women and the expectations that were common at the time, women were actually the perfect spies. They were trusted and they were seen as non-threatening. So men often really didn't see the need to be guarded around them. Any behaviors that were deemed unladylike, such as allowing men into their homes in the evenings, meeting with men in surreptitious locations, and appearing in public with a man without a chaperone, were all cause for women to be suspected. Those who were caught faced punishments that were usually much less severe than male spies. Eugenia was an outspoken Confederate sympathizer in Washington, D.C. at the outset of the war, while her husband supported the efforts of the federal government. Her vocal opposition to the United States cause resulted in Eugenia being placed on house arrest before her husband, who was a friend of future Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, was able to secure her release based on the understanding that the family would move south. So the Phillips did move to Richmond, where Eugenia took military maps and plans that she had smuggled out of Washington, D.C. and delivered them to Jefferson Davis. The family then made their way to New Orleans, where Eugenia continued to vocalize her support for the Confederate cause, despite the city being under control of General Benjamin the Beast Butler. On May 15, 1862, Butler issued what he called the Woman's Order, which read, "As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subjected to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation." A few days after the order was issued, Eugenia was accused of mocking the funeral of a Union soldier as it passed by her home. She claimed she was hosting a party for her children at the time, and her laughing was related to that, but Butler did not believe her and had her imprisoned on Ship Island off the Mississippi coast. As she was boarding the ship that would take her to the island, she is said to have told Butler, quote, "It has one advantage over the city, sir. You will not be there." I think many people felt that way about Benjamin Butler. During her 9-month stay on the island, Eugenia was subjected to terrible, unsanitary conditions, isolation, bad food, and what she described as fearful heat. While her health declined, Eugenia did not request any special privileges, but her circumstances became known and she began to become a martyr, which was really not in Benjamin Butler's best interest. Concerned for her health, her husband lobbied Butler for her release, and she very reluctantly took an oath not to give aid, comfort, or information to the rebels and was allowed to return to her family. The Phillips moved to LaGrange, Georgia, where they remained for the rest of the war. During Eugenia's first house arrest in Washington, D.C., she was placed in the home of Rose GREENHOW. Rose was a wealthy socialite from Maryland who was widowed with 3 children. She was recruited to work as a spy for the Confederacy by Virginia Governor John Letcher at the start of the war. Rose was enthusiastic about helping the rebels, and she used her knowledge of Washington, D.C. society to learn intelligence that could be used for the benefit of the rebellion. She was charming and was known to be an engaging conversationalist, qualities that she used to her advantage to get information from politicians and diplomats. She was credited by Jefferson Davis with helping the Confederates win the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861 by sending coded messages to General B.G.T. Beauregard via a female spy named Betty Duval. She hid a message in a small piece of silk and secured it to Betty's hair and sent her dressed like a farm girl. So remember, of course, women were non-threatening. Rose was arrested by Allen Pinkerton in August 1861 and was imprisoned, but she continued to send secret messages. She was released the following year and was sent on a diplomatic mission to Europe by Jefferson Davis with the goal of winning French and British support for the Confederacy. She met Napoleon III and Queen Victoria and became engaged to a British aristocrat on her trip. Rose died on her return trip to Virginia in 1864, and she was buried with full military honors. So, regarded as America's first female detective, Kate Warren began her career with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency when she was just 23 years old, shortly after she lost her husband. As Alan Pinkerton recalled, he expected that when she arrived at his office, she was looking for clerical work, but she convinced him that she could be a good detective. She quickly proved her skills, and Pinkerton put her in charge of the newly created Female Detective Bureau in 1860. The following year, Pinkerton named her as one of 5 detectives who investigated secessionist activity in Baltimore in the lead up to President Lincoln's inauguration. A gifted spy, her job was to pose as a Southern sympathizer to cultivate the wives and daughters of suspected plotters. She was able to learn details about the plot to assassinate Lincoln in this way. In describing her efforts, Pinkerton wrote, "Mrs. Warren was eminently fitted for this task. Of rather a commanding person, with clear-cut, expressive features, and with an ease of manner that was quite captivating at times, she was calculated to make a favorable impression at once. She was of Northern birth, but in order to vouch for her Southern opinions, she represented herself as from Montgomery, Alabama. Mrs. Warren displayed upon her breast, as did many of the ladies of Baltimore, the black and white cockade, which had been temporarily adopted as the emblem of secession, and many hints were dropped in her presence, which found their way to my ears and were of great benefit to me." Pinkerton's plan to get Lincoln to Washington, D.C. was to disguise him and put him on an earlier train to arrive before the expected time. So Lincoln boarded the train in disguise, and Kate Warren played the role of his sister, and she and Pinkerton remained with Lincoln throughout the trip. Kate and Pinkerton both served as spies throughout the rest of the war, and Kate easily was able to go undercover as a Southern woman to infiltrate gatherings and learn information. She continued to work as a detective after the war until her death in 1868 at the age of either 33 or 34, and she was buried in the Pinkerton family plot. Her obituary in the Democratic Inquirer, a newspaper of Ohio, stated that she was undoubtedly the best female detective in America, if not the world. While Warren disguised herself as a female or a Southern woman to gain information, Belle Boyd was a spy for the Confederacy, and she was known as the Cleopatra of secession. Boyd was a member of a Virginia family of Confederate sympathizers. In 1861, when she was just 17 years old, she killed a man who invaded her home, tore down the Confederate flag, and was disrespectful to her mother. Although she was acquitted, the incident brought her to the attention of Union soldiers who she would often manipulate into giving her information that would then be passed along to Confederate officers. Her missions often involved transporting information and supplies to Southern troops. Her young age allowed her to go virtually unnoticed by Union soldiers. The most famous incident of spying came in May 1862 while she was staying at a hotel owned by a relative in Fort Royal, Virginia. The hotel was under the control of Union officers at the time, and Belle is said to have listened in to a meeting through a hole in the door before riding through enemy lines to report to PGT Beauregard, supposedly dodging bullets on the way. She was arrested for espionage several times and always released within a few weeks. Ironically, during her last arrest, she fell in love with a Union soldier who helped her escape to London, where they were married. Sadly, her husband died shortly after, and Belle went on to become an actress. Following her return to the United States, she gave presentations on her wartime experiences throughout the country. Elizabeth Van Lew is an interesting figure. She was a Southern woman from a wealthy Virginia family who worked as a spy for the Union. Elizabeth attended a Quaker school in Philadelphia, where she developed sympathy for the abolitionist cause. Following her father's death, she convinced her brother to emancipate the people the family had enslaved, many of whom remained with the family as paid servants. After the war, Elizabeth and her mother aided Union soldiers in Libby prison outside of Richmond, even smuggling out letters and gathering valuable information about Confederate strategy from prisoners and guards. She was recruited as a spy by Benjamin Butler in 1863 and eventually became the head of the spy network in Richmond, even recruiting new members. With the help of her employee, Mary Bowser, she sent coded messages to Union officers using invisible ink and hiding messages in hollowed out eggs and vegetables. After the fall of Richmond in April 1865, Elizabeth flew the Stars and Stripes over her home, earning her the scorn of her neighbors. Despised by the people in Richmond, Elizabeth earned the respect of Ulysses S. Grant, who appointed her as the city's postmaster. Sadly, she used her family's wealth to support her espionage activities and lived in poverty later in her life. When her situation became known, the family of a Union officer who she helped during the war supported her until her death in 1900. As I mentioned, Elizabeth Van Loo was aided by Mary Elizabeth Bowser. Mary was freed by Elizabeth's family in the 1840s and remained with them as a paid employee. She was educated at a Quaker school for African Americans in Philadelphia and spent her teenage years as a missionary in Africa. She returned to Virginia in 1860 and she was married the following year. Because of Elizabeth's prominent position, Mary was hired as a servant for parties held by Varina Davis in the Confederate White House, during which she could obtain information. Using her education and her photographic memory, she was able to relay information obtained from military documents and conversations she overheard. Jefferson Davis eventually suspected Mary as a spy, and it is said that she attempted to burn down the Confederate White House before leaving Richmond. Little is known of her life after the war, but it's believed that she joined the lecture circuit using an alias Mary Jane Richards. And there are some stories that she may have kept a diary that was inadvertently destroyed by her descendants in the mid-20th century. It would be tragic, of course, if it was in fact true. Another formerly enslaved woman who worked as a spy was Harriet Tubman. You are probably familiar with her remarkable life story. She's one of the most celebrated people in this nation's history. Harriet was a self-emancipated woman who was a prominent abolitionist in the antebellum period. She bravely worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad for over a decade before the Civil War began, concluding with her last mission in December 1860. The exact number of people she saved is unknown. You'll sometimes hear the number 300 being cited, but Harriet is said to have claimed to have helped about 50 people before her last mission, where she saved 7 more. When the war began, she volunteered as a cook and nurse at Fort Monroe before being recruited by the Union officers to establish a spy network. Harriet's work with the Underground Railroad made her knowledgeable about routes to take and the lay of the land. She recruited former slaves to look for rebel camps and report on the movements of Confederate troops. In June of 1863, information from her scouts led to a gunboat raid in South Carolina led by Colonel James Montgomery to free enslaved people on rice plantations along the Combahee River. Harriet accompanied the raiders, which included about 150 Black troops. The raid destroyed a Confederate supply depot and it freed over 750 people. In the post-war period, Harriet devoted her life to helping newly emancipated people who were living in poverty. Pauline Cushman was a struggling stage actress working in Louisville, Kentucky in the early years of the war. While she was there, she was approached by 2 Confederate officers to toast Confederate President Jefferson Davis during her performance. She reported the men to the local provost marshal, who asked her to follow through with the toast and gain the trust of local Confederate sympathizers. She did so, and she became a spy for the Union. She was soon sent to Nashville to work with the Army of the Cumberland, where she began to pose as a camp follower and a soldier to gain information about Confederate battle plans and identified Confederate spies. She was found out and imprisoned and sentenced to death for espionage, but she was freed by the Union Army before the sentence could be carried out. She returned to acting and gave lectures on the war, sometimes while wearing military uniforms, as you can see here. When she died of an overdose at 60, she was buried with military honors by veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic in San Francisco. Cushman's disguise as a soldier, or her posing with a uniform is an example of actually hundreds of women who were actually believed to have done the same thing. While they were forbidden from enlisting, women joined the military disguised as men for a variety of reasons. Female soldiers charged into battle, they lived in camp, they suffered the deprivations of prisons, and they were injured and killed. While a widely estimated number says that 400 women may have served, it's impossible to know since so many went undetected throughout the entirety of their service. Without standardized physical exams in the military, it was not terribly difficult for women to fool male recruiters, who were mostly focusing on hearing, vision, and physical disabilities. You may recognize the photos on the screen of Frances Clayton, dressed in both a military uniform and a woman's dress. Clayton was the mother of 3 when she enlisted as Jack Williams in a Missouri Artillery and Cavalry Corps alongside her husband in 1861. Frances Clayton was tall with a broad physique, and she used that to her advantage. To be a believable soldier, she practiced walking, talking, and riding like a man. Frances and her husband fought in the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862, where she was wounded, but she was able to maintain her secret. In late 1862, the Claytons served in the Battle of Stones River, where, according to Frances, she stepped over her husband's body after he was killed to continue to fight. She said she was discharged shortly after his death, and she confessed her deception. According to Frances, she attempted to collect her husband's pay, but was robbed by Confederate bushwhackers. The stories of Frances's service came from interviews that she did after being discharged, but very little is known of her other than that. It's not unusual. When not discovered, women who disguised themselves as men could go throughout the entirety of war, and they did, undetected. One of the more successful and well-documented female soldiers was Sarah Edmonds. A Canadian by birth, Sarah moved to the United States in 1856, fleeing an abusive father and a forced marriage. It is at this time that she took the name Franklin Thompson and began her life as a man, which had less restrictions than she would have found as a woman. Enlisting as Franklin in the 2nd Michigan Infantry early in the war, Sarah served as a nurse and mail carrier and took part in the battles of First Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Antietam. She served as a spy and infiltrated the Confederate military on several occasions, including as a Southern sympathizer named Charles Mayberry and an Irish peddler, Bridget O'Shea. In 1863, she deserted after catching malaria and feared that doctors might learn her secret. Throughout the remainder of the war, Sarah served as a female nurse at a Washington, D.C. hospital. She published her memoir, Nurse and Spy in the Union Army, in 1865. After the war, she married and had 3 children. She received a pension for her military service in 1886 with a letter from the Secretary of War describing her as, quote, a female soldier who served as a private, rendering faithful service in the ranks. She also became the only known female member of the Grand Army of the Republic. Another woman whose service is documented is Sarah Rosetta Wakeman. Sarah was born in New York in 1853, and she was the youngest of 9 children. In 1862, she disguised herself as a man and took a job as a boatman in New York. In August of that same year, using the name LYONS Wakeman, Sarah enlisted in the 153rd New York Infantry, claiming the $152 bounty that was being offered. The regiment served in Washington, D.C. before being transferred to Louisiana to take part in the Red River Campaign in 1864. And if you know about the Red River Campaign, you'll be familiar with the stories of a forced march throughout the swampy country, and it resulted in the loss of many men, but Sarah persevered. She fought in the Battle of Pleasant Hill in April 1864, where she and her company fought back enemy forces. Sarah reported to the regimental hospital in New Orleans on May 3rd, and she died on June 19th, 1864. She was buried at LYONS Wakeman in Chalmette National Cemetery in New Orleans. During her time in the Army, Sarah wrote to her family frequently. Her letters detailed the boredom of everyday camp life, the fears of never seeing her family again, and the hardships of combat. Fortunately, her family preserved her letters, which provide a unique look at the experiences of a woman disguised as a man during the war. Another soldier who wrote to their family during the war was Albert Cashier. Born Jenny Hodgers in Ireland in 1843, Albert Cashier began living as a man prior to the war when his father dressed him as a boy to earn money to help the family. He enlisted in the 95th Illinois Infantry in August 1862 and went undetected despite his requests to bathe and dress privately, which many men actually preferred. He fought in 40 battles and even received medical care for illness, all without being discovered. He was captured during the Siege of Vicksburg in May 1863 and escaped by wrestling away a gun from his captors and running away. After the war, he continued to live as Albert Cashier and settled in a small town in Illinois. As a Civil War veteran, Albert was respected in the community and he found work as a village lamplighter. Although several people were aware of his secret, his identity was discovered late in his life when his physical and mental health deteriorated and he was declared insane by the state of Illinois. The discovery resulted in an attempt to take away his veteran's pension on the grounds of identity fraud, but several of his officers and comrades came to his defense, and he was recognized as a veteran who fought bravely for the Union cause. In recent years, you can see the tomb you see here was erected, which carries both the names Albert Cashier and Jenny Hodgers. And you'll surely note that I used male pronouns in telling you about Albert, and that is out of respect for his commitment to live as a man throughout his entire life. And it's actually in line with how the American Battlefield Trust, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, and other sources discuss him. There are also examples of women who fought for the Confederacy, like LORETA JANETA VELAZQUEZ. LORETA was born to a wealthy family in Cuba, and she was educated in New Orleans from a young age. At the outset of the war, she was married and living in Texas, and when her husband enlisted in the military, she wanted to join him. When he refused and left, she disguised herself as a man named Harry T. Buford and raised a regiment in Arkansas, which she then presented to her husband. Her husband was killed shortly after they reunited, and she went north to unofficially join a regiment and fought in the battles of First Bull Run and Ball's Bluff. She also served as a spy in Washington, D.C. for a brief period before returning to the battlefield. LORETA was wounded in the battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and she was found out and fined for impersonating a man. At this point, LORETA returned to working as a spy in Richmond, presenting herself as both a man and a woman. She dedicated her 1876 memoirs, The Woman in Battle, to her Confederate comrades who, quote, although they fought in a losing cause, succeeded by their valor in winning the admiration of the world. While some, like Confederate General Jubal Early, denounced it as fiction, historians have determined that it was at least partially accurate. Early's denial was not unusual. Despite instances where women soldiers were acknowledged, some in the military denied that there were actually any official records of women well into the 20th century. There are actual discharge documents for women from the war, including one from 1862 where a woman was discharged for, quote, sexual incompatibility. There's also an interesting document that was written to General Rosecrans in the Department of the Cumberland 1863, which said, quote, the medical doctor reports that an orderly sergeant was today delivered of a daughter, which is in violation of all military law and army regulations. No such case has been known since the days of Jupiter. So you can see that the military really had no idea how to deal with these types of situations. And we're fortunate that some women chose to write down their stories, as they likely would have been lost to history otherwise. So women like Sarah Edmonds and Loretta Velazquez wrote their memoirs, and others kept diaries telling their experiences. Perhaps the most well-known female diarist of this period was Mary Chestnut, a prominent South Carolina socialite. Mary and her husband were supportive of secession, and her husband served as an aide to General P.G.T. Beauregard and and Jefferson Davis during the war. She accompanied her husband on his military missions and documented her observations in a diary which opened on February 15, 1861 and closed August 2nd, 1865. Describing scenes from the bombardment of Fort Sumter through the end of the war, Mary's writings provide valuable insight into Southern society and the inner workings of military and political leaders. Of the impending war, she wrote, quote, this Southern Confederacy must be supported now by calm determination and cool brains. We have risked all, and we must play our best, for the stake is life or death. Then, in 1864, her entries provided an accurate assessment of the rebellion, where she wrote, quote, "We have lost nearly all of our men and we have no money. Our best and brightest are under the sod." The diary offers a view of the effects of the war on the wealthy planter class who were at the forefront of the secession movement. Although she hoped to publish the diary and even reworked it in the 1870s, it was not published until 20 years after her death. She died in 1886. Another woman who documented her observations during the war was Hannah Anderson Ropes. An abolitionist from New England, Hannah served as head matron of the Union Hospital in Washington, D.C., where Louisa May Alcott also served for a brief period. She was vocal about the appalling conditions in the hospital, including the lack of sanitation and ill treatment of soldiers by doctors and surgeons. She believed that soldiers deserved a clean, healthy environment, good food, humane treatment, all of which, of course, expectations that we have today, but weren't necessarily that common at the time. She made it her priority to ensure those expectations were met, writing in her diary, quote, "The poor privates are my special children of the present. The loss they have experienced in health and in spirits and weakened faith in man, as well as shattered hopes in themselves." She even took on doctors and nurses who she felt were abusing their positions, including having a surgeon arrested for selling food and clothing that were meant for the hospital. Hannah put all of her energy into her work at the hospital. She contracted typhus from 4 ill soldiers that she and Louisa May Alcott treated, and she died in January 1863. Her diary was published as Civil War Nurse, The Diary and Letters of Hannah Ropes in 1980, and is a useful resource to understanding the challenges that female nurses faced during the war. Hannah's descendants donated materials that were made by her to the Lincoln Shrine in the 1980s. Charlotte Forten was a member of a well-educated, well-to-do family of abolitionists in Philadelphia. Excuse me. Charlotte was a teacher by training and dedicated her time to helping the anti-slavery cause, including publishing poems in abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator and The Evangelist, and working to bring women to the crusade. When the war began, she was recruited by the military to teach emancipated African Americans on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where plantations were abandoned at the start of the war, leaving behind nearly 10,000 enslaved people. In addition to teaching, Charlotte worked with children and the elderly, telling stories and leading songs. Among the people she met at this time was Harriet Tubman. She also met Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the 54th Massachusetts. She chronicled her experiences in Life on the Sea Islands, which was published in the Atlantic Monthly in May and June of 1864. She included the following story about her time on the island. Quote, "Notwithstanding the heat, we determined to celebrate the 4th of July as worthily as we could. The freed people and the children of the different schools assembled in the grove near the Baptist church. The flag was hung across the road between 2 magnificent live oaks, and the children, being grouped under it, sang the Star-Spangled Banner with much spirit." After the war, Charlotte worked with the Freedmen's Union Commission in Boston and went on to marry Francis Grimke, who was the nephew of well-known abolitionists and women's rights crusaders Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Another woman who focused on education was Susie King Taylor. Susie was born into slavery in Savannah, Georgia, and emancipated herself during the bombardment of Fort Pulaski in April 1862. Along with her uncle and his family, Susie fled to St. Simon's Island, Georgia, where enslaved people were liberated by the United States military. Because Susie was literate, she was asked to establish a school and became the first Black teacher to openly instruct African Americans in Georgia. Using books provided by the Navy, Susie taught children during the day and adults at night. When the Navy left the island with the 33rd USCT, Susie accompanied them, working as a laundress and nurse for the remainder of the war. When the war was over, Susie worked as a domestic servant and educated herself and dedicated herself to the Women's Relief Corps, which was an auxiliary of the Civil War Veterans Organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. She recorded her wartime experiences in her diary, which was published as Reminiscences of My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troop Late 1st SC Volunteers in 1902. And that really offers a rare perspective of an African-American woman during the Civil War. Susie summarized the war like this in her book, quote, "What a wonderful revolution. In 1861, the Southern papers were full of advertisements for slaves, but now, despite all the hindrances and race problems, my people are striving to attain the full standard of all other races born free in the sight of God, and in a number of instances have succeeded. Just as we ask to be citizens of these United States, where so many of our people have shed their blood with their white comrades, that the stars and stripes should never be polluted." Many of the women I've highlighted had the benefit of financial stability and/or the support of families, communities, but they were extraordinary cases. Millions more women remained remained at home and focused on providing for themselves and their families. With husbands and fathers and brothers in the Army, women were left to provide for their families on their own. They filled both roles on the homestead, ran family businesses, and found ways to supplement family income. Some found success and others faced terrible poverty. With the workforce depleted, women were given the opportunity to fill roles traditionally held by men. As a result, many found themselves working outside the home to earn money for the first time in their lives. Immigrants and free women of color were more likely to seek employment and were considered secondary to white women. In the South, the demand for workers was so great that free and enslaved Black women found opportunities to work for wages. But that was not the norm. Unpaid labor across the Confederacy was critical to the war effort, and enslaved people continued to labor in the South during the war, growing food, mining salt, and producing munitions. Enslaved women continued to be forced to endure hard labor, beatings, rape, family separation, and death. Those who were freed by the military could attach themselves to armies where they could work as nurses, cooks, and laundresses. So what happened to the women's place in society once the war was over? Women challenged gender norms and expectations during the war, debunking ideas of their abilities and excelling in fields that were close to them before the war began. Female nurses, clerks, bookkeepers, salespersons showed that they were just as able to fill these roles as men. But once the war was over, the expectation was that women would return to their pre-war lives and reestablish the societal and gender norms of the antebellum period. There was a great push to return to the ideals of the cult of true womanhood and give up the freedom and opportunities that came during the war in order to create a familiar space for men to return to. And in many ways, it was really too late to return to the way things were before. In the South, in particular, a greater percentage of men died during the war, leaving a high proportion of women and children being left widowed and orphaned. The post-war period saw the establishment of nursing schools for women and an increase in females employed to do clerical work. In fact, the 1870 US Census was the first to count females engaged in each occupation. The reality is that women of the Civil War set a precedent that had lasting impacts that continue to reverberate into future generations. And here's just a list of some of the books, memoirs, or diaries that I mentioned, but there are many others that you can find. So I do urge you to continue to do research if you're interested in this topic. And with that, I want to thank you. And